Now, instead of asking you all to put away your cell phones, I suggest you keep them handy so you can take a photo of any slide of information of particular interest, especially during Mark's talk. Welcome to all, welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Phil Coonley, a member of both 350 Mass Metronorth Node and of the Winchester Unitarian Society's Green Sanctuary Committee, the groups which developed this seminar. These two organizations were joined in promoting the event by the 8 other organizations you see listed. Thanks to each of these groups active in furthering environmental responsibility for helping us out. Thanks also to the many individuals who organized this event or facilitated its production. And I want to particularly introduce James Schoen, our patient and skilled Zoom producer, who has volunteered many hours helping the rest of us older folk like me get our acts together. Given how much each of these individuals have had to do for this seminar to happen, I now appreciate why movies sometimes scroll hundreds of names in the credentials. This is our premiere, so we hope for connection more than perfection. And finally, the entire team offers special appreciation to our 9 fabulous speakers, only one of which you get to hear today. And they are, I'm not seeing the, okay, we've got, why am I not seeing the top of that slide? Anyway, I'll go from the bottom. Emily Hitchcock and Charlotte Hitchcock, John Waukee, Ingrid Geis, Alan Field, Roger Rosen, Cora Weissbourd, Ken Pruitt, and Mark Sandeen. Thanks, there's Mark. You're going to see more of Mark. Our goal today is for the 6 90-minute programs to leave you with 3 things. The first is realistic hope that notwithstanding the seriousness of the climate crisis that human behavior has already caused and is still accelerating, there are sound reasons to know it can be solved in ways that are both surprisingly practical and benign. As Rumi says, ours is no caravan of despair. The second thing we want all to have is a better understanding of impactful actions one can take, especially at the individual, local, and state levels. The third thing we hope is that you will leave with pathways to connections with others. Working in a group with congenial people can be far more effective than working alone, and thus more satisfying and even fun. Each of the 6 units begins with a short video from Drawdown's Climate Solutions 101. All are narrated by Jonathan Foley, Executive Director of Project Drawdown. Some of you know of Project Drawdown's book and related videos. The book is worth looking at, for it speaks succinctly and factually to 80 promising developments. Drawdown's mission is to help the world reach drawdown sooner, the point where levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere stop climbing and start to steadily decline. Our program today begins with the first video in the Climate Solution 101 series titled Setting the Stage. After we watch the video, we'll all meet in small breakout rooms to share our insights. Then we'll have a brief report from these groups via chat. Next, we'll have the pleasure of listening to today's speaker, Mark Sandeen, member of the Lexington Select Board and a climate activist. Mark will share some climate actions that have been successful. Following his remarks, Mark will answer your questions. After a preview of next week's program and a request for some feedback from you, we'll wrap up by 5:30. And then we'll have a nice music video as you provide your feedback. Okay, let's get going with screening of the 13-minute video, Setting the Stage.
So welcome to Climate Solutions 101. We're going to get started to think about how we're going to address climate change and how we're going to solve one of the world's biggest problems. We want to set the stage and understand how this moment in human history, this moment of climate change and climate solutions, got started in the first place. When we think about human history, we have to go back a long, long time. It turns out our ancient ancestors started walking this planet about 6 million years ago. And during all that time, early humans and our ancestors started to affect the environment. But they did it very locally, just right around where they lived. But something really changed in the last century, especially the last 50 years or so. We began to change the entire planet, all at once, in several different ways. Well, one of the things that happened, of course, is there are a lot more people on the planet. We're now over 7.5 billion people walking the Earth today and climbing. We also, for the first time in history, became an urban species. Over half the people on Earth now live in a city. That's never happened before. We also formed a global economy that is powered by technology and international trade, and has been growing faster than ever. In fact, if you look at the last 50 years, we see about a doubling of global population. The economy globally grew between 5 and 6-fold. So think about that, twice as many people doing almost 6 times more stuff. We then use about 3 times more food, twice as much water, and 3 times more fossil fuels than we did back in 1970. In the last 50 years, we have changed more than the previous 6 million years. In a way, it's kind of an inflection point. It's when everything's changing. Even the way we're changing is changing right now. And unfortunately, this change in us is also changing the planet in ways that are incredibly disruptive. Some of these changes you can see by just looking out the window. They're obvious. They're really right in front of you. For example, when we cut down a forest, we go in with chainsaws and bulldozers and set things on fire. You obviously can see that. And we're doing a lot of it. If we look at the Earth from outer space, we can see forest with a satellite. Here's a picture of a pretty remote part of the Amazon in Bolivia in the 1970s. And if you look carefully, there's a little dirt road running right through the middle of that forest. The very first clearings, just starting in 1975. But if we go back here about 25 years later, the whole area has been radically transformed into soybean fields. And those soybeans are being shipped all the way to China to be used as animal feed. So a global economy connecting the Amazon to Chinese pigs is clearing rainforest in a remote part of the world. And this is happening everywhere. In fact, we're seeing so far about 30% of all the tropical forests on Earth have been lost, and a lot of that in the last few decades. We also see how agriculture, just farming, is changing the world. We usually think of farming on a small scale, like an individual farmer's field. We can walk through it, we can pull up a carrot, we can look at the cows and all this kind of thing. But agriculture is now a global force. Again, if we look at it from satellite, the Earth is covered in agriculture. This map shows in green the areas where we grow our crops. That includes the plants we eat, of course, but also the plants we feed to animals, and some we feed to cars in the form of biofuels. The brown areas are where we actually raise the remaining animals, our pastures and rangelands. And if you put it all together, agriculture now covers over a third, between 35 and 40%, of all the land on the planet. It is now the largest ecosystem on Earth, and that's incredible. So we've changed forests, we've changed the world through agriculture, and we're also changing the nature of water across the planet. We're a pretty thirsty species. We use a lot of water on this planet for our homes, to drink, and we use water in industry, and we use most of our water, though, in agriculture. About 70% of the water we take out of nature is used for just one thing: irrigation. Let me show you how that can affect the world, though. Here's a picture of the Aral Sea from the late 1960s. This is a satellite picture showing one of the world's largest inland bodies of water in the middle of Central Asia in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. But the Soviet Union in the 60s and 70s diverted the rivers that would feed the Aral Sea. Instead, they sent that water over into the deserts of Kazakhstan to grow cotton in the middle of the desert. And this is what happened. It shut off the water supply of one of the world's great inland seas, and it disappeared. And this is not just unique to Central Asia. This kind of overuse of water resources is happening in California. It's happening in the Midwest and the Great Plains and our Ogallala Aquifer. It happens in North Africa. It happens in Australia. It happens in China and everywhere. In fact, our thirst for water has massively disrupted water resources and ecosystems across the globe. So these changes we've seen in like forest and land and water, they're just plain as day. We can see them, we can photograph them, they're right in front of us. But some other changes happening to the planet were initially a little bit more subtle, especially changes to our atmosphere and to the climate of our planet. This story actually begins more or less in the 1800s. Starting back then, we began activities, especially the burning of fossil fuels and the explosion of agriculture, that started to change the nature of our atmosphere. For example, we saw that CO2 levels, one of the major so-called greenhouse gases, started to increase from the 1800s till about now. And it's so far increased by about 50%. And today, greenhouse gas levels are higher than they've been for 3 to 5 million years. We've never seen something like this in any time in human existence. And later I'll talk about this, how greenhouse gases going up causes the temperature of the planet to go up. And while the greenhouse gases like CO2 have risen, so have the temperatures of our planet. In fact, the temperature of our planet is warmed by about 1 degree Celsius already. Initially, that was a little subtle. Maybe it was a half a degree or 0.6 of a degree and so on. And we could argue whether this was happening or not. But today, it is plain as day that we have changed the temperature of our planet, and it's getting warmer faster all the time. We're seeing the effects of a warmer planet almost everywhere we look. One of the early signs was looking at our glaciers. Here in Alaska, we have the Muir Glacier, which now has to be relabeled Muir Lake. We also see in South America, on the other side of the world, how glaciers in Patagonia and South America are melting, forming large lakes as well. Perhaps most disturbingly, though, is changes to an entire ocean. We're seeing how the Arctic Ocean, which is usually covered in sea ice year-round, has been melting year by year by year. Here in the 1980s, we see when sea ice is at its kind of minimum in late summer, early fall. But by the early 2010s, we see a massive reduction in sea ice, which continues to this day. And soon, maybe within a decade or so, we'll have the first ice-free Arctic months in all of recent geologic time. And we're seeing a planet radically transformed by our actions. And again, this all became possible in the last 50 years or so. Scientists often call this period of time the Great Acceleration, when everything started to take off. We see population change, urbanization, globalization, and then we started clearing ecosystems like forest, and we built up more and more farms around the world. We started building huge dams and using more and more water than ever before. We also use more fertilizers and more chemicals, especially in agriculture and industry, and those change the nature of water, even at the scale of our oceans. And then, of course, we're farming the oceans. We're harvesting more fish than ever and doing what we call aquaculture, or fish farms, at a scale unlike anything we've ever seen. But the really scary big thing that's happening, of course, is climate change. Our use of energy, our clearing of land, and a few other things have changed the nature of the entire atmosphere forever. And those changes are going to make the planet warmer. And if we keep going, it's going to be a massive disruption to everything on the planet. Not just the thermometers, not just the polar bears, but us. In fact, climate change has the potential to hurt the most vulnerable people among us, people living right on the edge of poverty or food security or having fresh water or good, safe places to live. Climate change is going to put a huge burden on future generations, people who didn't emit anything. They're not even born yet. And yet we could be leaving a giant mess on their doorstep that could last for centuries or thousands of years. Now, I wouldn't blame you one bit if you took all of this information in and said, this looks really grim, and maybe it's even hopeless. I'm going to stop you right there, because it's not true. It is not hopeless at all. In fact, there are a lot of things that are getting better. At the same time, the environmental situation is getting worse. Let me remind you of a few of these. During the last 50 years, for example, humans have gotten healthier. We used to live to be about 55 years on average on this planet, just back in the 1970s. Today, the average person on Earth can be expecting to live to be over 70, 71. That's amazing. We also see that women have many fewer children. 50 years ago, the average woman on Earth had over 5 children, on average. Today, it's 2.4 and falling faster than anybody ever predicted. And those children are healthier, with stronger families, and women have more opportunities than they've had before. We also see the world is far more literate than it's ever been. Today, 86% of the world's population can read and write. Back in 1970, that was only 50%. And back in 1900, it was only 15%. And at that point, is the highest in all of history. We are healthier, we have more rights, and we're more educated and literate than anybody who's ever lived before. We're also more urban, we're more mobile, we're more connected and less violent than any people who've ever walked before us. So this is an interesting paradox, isn't it? Some things are getting better, some things are really getting worse. A lot of people come up to me and ask, like, well, so what's the future gonna be? Is it gonna be a total disaster, kind of like a Mad Max movie, some dystopian science fiction disaster film? Or is it going to be awesome? Is it going to be like a Star Trek movie where we pull ourselves out of this mess and build an incredible future and seize this amazing opportunity we have to become better? Which one's it going to be? Well, the answer is, it's up to you. It's up to us. It's up to everybody. We get to build the future we want. It hasn't happened yet. We don't know what tomorrow is going to be because we haven't built tomorrow yet. The future is ours to choose, so we have to choose a good one. And we can choose a world if we want to. If we really put our minds to it, we still have the ability to build a future where people and nature can thrive, today and tomorrow. But to get there, we're going to have to do the hardest thing of all. We're going to have to step back as a people and make our choice, to make the choice of a generation, of this moment in history. We have to choose between the people we are or the people we can be. The people like some of our ancestors who gave everything so that we could live better lives. We are capable of so much, and yet we have realized so little. What do we choose? And we could choose the world that is. That's a giant mess right now in a lot of ways. Or we could choose the world that could be, an incredible world full of potential when we seize all of our creativity and energy to build the world that we want. So which one are you going to choose? Which one are we all going to choose? The future of the world and everyone who will live after us will depend on that decision.
I've seen this video 5 times now, and my reaction differs each time. So I'm sure that among you, there are many different thoughts about what you saw and heard. To explore these, you have been randomly assigned a small group breakout room. In the breakout rooms, please follow 3 guidelines. For those with memories as short as mine, the info in this slide and the next will be placed in your breakout rooms chat. The 3 guidelines. Be sure everyone has an opportunity to speak and be heard. Try both and speaking. More than one reality or perspective can be true at the same time. And 3, know what others have said and build on each other's ideas. Once all, usually 4 in the breakout room, please first introduce yourselves to your group and share a couple things about yourself. After these introductions, please discuss 3 questions. I'll put these in the chat too. Question 1, what brought you here today? Number 2, what stood out most for you in the video? And number 3, if you were to share one thought from your small group to the entire group, what could it be? Please put the consensus thought in the chat. Then please copy it. So after you regain entry to the whole group, you can paste what you copied into the chat that the whole group can see. You will be in the breakout room for about 12 minutes, and you'll get a time reminder every 3 minutes and at the last 30 minutes. These reminders show up at the top middle of your screen. When you see the invite, please join your breakout room.
A couple of years later, we had a public hearing on natural gas leaks when it was highlighted that we were having a large and growing problem of methane leaks in our town and in our area. And in 2017, we launched our community choice program, which has 100% renewable energy. And in 2018, the select board adopted a sustainable action plan and a getting to net zero emissions plan for the entire town. And in 2019, the town of Lexington adopted our integrated building design policy for our own municipal and school building designs. And that has resulted in our first 2 net zero schools. And in the lower right corner, you see a picture in front of the Minuteman statue. Our Lexington High School students organized in 2019 a climate strike. About 1,000 people went on strike, students went on strike and asked town meeting to declare a climate emergency, which we did. So what is Lexington's Sustainable Action Plan? Well, basically the idea is that we identified sectors, 10 different sectors, health, safety, buildings, energy, where we would look at what are the top priorities to accomplish in each one of those sectors and put some energy behind those to impact Lexington citizens' quality of life, their health, their resilience, and the town's sustainability. And basically a sustainable action plan looks at 2 things: mitigation and adaptation. How do we reduce the amount of emissions that we're producing? And how do we adapt to the changes that are ongoing in our town? And we set as a goal for ourselves, could we provide essential services like police, fire, food, shelter for 3 weeks following an extreme event? When we look at our priority from a mitigation standpoint, from an emissions perspective, we see that this is our status in 2012 when we put the Sustainable Action Plan in place. We saw that about 36% of all of our emissions were coming from electricity, and about another 30% of all of our emissions were coming from fuel used to burn and heat our homes. So 66% all of our emissions were going to our buildings. 22% was our driving, our cars, 9% was our food, and only 2%, people tend to think about a sustainable action plan, 2% was just what we use as a municipality for our schools and our town. So then we wanted to take a look at what our greatest vulnerabilities are. The town has participated in a municipal vulnerability program to identify what our greatest vulnerabilities are. And because we're not in a coastal community, our primary vulnerabilities come from extreme storms which cause power outages and flooding. And when you get flooding, you get toxic contamination. And when you get those power outages, you find the most vulnerable populations, whether it's an extreme heat storm or an extreme cold time, will need shelter, food, water, and medicine. So we have spent a bunch of time looking at how do we adapt our infrastructure to provide resilience in the event of extreme storms. Our Sustainable Action Plan, as I mentioned before, covers 10 different sectors. And as I mentioned also before, our #1 priority from an emissions perspective was our buildings. So we designed a getting to net zero emissions plan to address how we reduce our emissions from our buildings. And we put a number of different programs in place underneath that emissions plan to move us along. But the basic idea of the getting to net zero emissions plan is we set a 25-year goal. That was in 2018. So we have now until 2043 to reduce all greenhouse gas emissions from every one of our buildings in town, residential, commercial, and municipal, and achieve a transition to a complete renewable energy source. And that sounds like an incredibly daunting challenge, but it really comes down to 4 things. We said we're going to report, we're going to reduce, we're going to produce, and we're going to purchase. And basically the fundamental underpinning of anything you do when you're getting to net zero emissions is you need to know where you stand and you need to measure your progress towards your goal. So we have report, which is assessing what our current building's performance is and doing that on an ongoing basis. And reduce, really, there's only two ways to reduce your emissions. You can either be more efficient in terms of the way you use your energy and use less energy, or you can switch to cleaner sources of fuel. So we're doing both of those things. And when you switch to cleaner sources of fuel, one of the best ways to do that is to produce the maximum amount of renewable energy on site that you can do. But we all know that not every home is able to put solar panels on their roof and generate all the electricity that they need. So that means that the rest of the energy that we use, we need to buy from a renewable electricity source. And so in 2017, we started Lexington's Community Choice Program. And from the very beginning, we said we want that Community Choice Program default to be 100% renewable electricity. And the interesting thing is that today we have 10,000 customers, over 10,000 customers who are on this 100% renewable energy source. And we have saved Lexington residents $5 million over these 5 years on their electricity costs while providing them with 100% renewable energy. That's 75% of all the residential electricity in town and 17% of all the commercial revenue electricity in town. So when Lexington started this when we started this effort in 2015 or so, there were only 12 communities in the state that had adopted a community choice program. Today, there's 154 municipalities that have active programs, and about 50 of them are actually using the program to generate cleaner electricity. So our Getting to Net Zero Emissions plan has this waterfall that helps you identify what needs to happen in order to get to zero emissions. And at the top, you'll see in the yellow, we need to get rid of our natural gas leaks. That's one of the biggest sources of emissions in the town, is the leaks that we have coming from our methane pipes under our streets. That big blue area that you see there, that's what you do by switching to zero emissions electricity, 100% renewable electricity. And you can see that by reducing our leaks and switching to 100% renewable electricity, you get about halfway to the goal. And then you start looking at fuel switching, and you start moving from oil and propane to electric heat pumps, and you start moving from natural gas boilers to heat pumps, and you have to do energy efficiency retrofits at the same time to make this all work from an economic perspective. And then finally, a lot of people think we spent a lot of time in the last few weeks talking about a net zero stretch energy code. And we will need to have all of the new buildings that we build start off being all electric from the beginning if we want to achieve our goals. So this is a very complicated chart. It looks kind of complicated. It's all of Massachusetts energy consumption. And what you're seeing on the left side is all the sources of our energy. And what you're seeing on the right is what is actually delivered. And what I want you to take a look at here is the big gray box. What that is showing you is that all of that energy is wasted. The stuff on the bottom is what is actually getting used. And what you're going to see at the very top is that 66% of all the energy that goes to our power plants to produce electricity goes up the cooling towers as waste heat. And if you look at the very bottom there, you're looking at oil going to our cars. You're going to see that 80% of all the gasoline and diesel that you put in your tank goes up into the atmosphere as waste heat. We can do better. So the next chart, this is also saying, where are our emissions coming from? And this sort of helps you think about what our problem is very clearly, because what you can see is that all of our emissions in the state of Massachusetts come from burning natural gas or burning oil. And that's what we need to be thinking about. How do we stop burning natural gas and burning oil? So let me talk to you about the integrated building design policy we put together in Lexington. We decided that we wanted to set higher design standards and require that all of our own school and municipal buildings be all electric, very healthy buildings with incredibly high indoor air quality, and generate as much on-site renewable energy as possible, and design that with exceptional resilience with energy storage for batteries. And what we find is that by doing that, you not only get better performance from a climate perspective, but your students have better cognitive performance. And what we've been able to do in the town of Lexington is this has lowered our total cost of ownership of these buildings. So we get all electric, incredibly healthy buildings, net zero buildings with exceptional resilience, and it's costing us less. So let me tell you the story of Hastings School. When Hastings School first came up for discussion in the town of Lexington, it was probably 2014, 2013, something along that lines. And we said, could we make this a net zero school? And the architect said, no, you just can't do that. It's a 3-story building, it's impossible. And we said, well, why? And they said, well, it's a 3-story building. It uses lots of energy, and the heating and ventilating systems on the roof, and there's not going to be any room to put solar panels on the roof if you are doing standard heating and ventilating. We said, well, what if we did ground source heat pumps? And they said, well, yeah, then you wouldn't have anything on the roof, and you could cover the entire roof with solar panels. But they said, you're still not going to have enough solar energy in order to cover this. And we said, well, what about the parking lots? And at the end of the day, what we found was that we could put solar energy canopies out in the parking lot, and those generate 2/3 of all the energy needed for the school. And the rooftops generate 1/3 of all the energy needed by the school on an annual basis. And we did this with the highest levels of indoor air quality ventilation. So we have exceptional indoor air quality while we're not burning any fossil fuels in this building whatsoever. I mentioned building energy reporting. One of the things that is sort of maybe unusual for some of the other towns in the area, but for Lexington, 66% of all of our electricity is used by our commercial buildings and 50% of our natural gas use. So we have a high importance of getting control of what's going on with our commercial side of our town. And one of the things that we found is that there's 116 buildings that are over 25,000 square feet, and they're responsible for about 80 to 90% of all the emissions coming from our commercial buildings in town. So we've modeled this from our own schools and town buildings. And what we're bringing to town meeting in this spring session is we're going to start asking our largest commercial property owners in town to report on an annual basis 2 very simple facts. How many kilowatt hours of electricity do you use? And how many therms of natural gas do you use? Oh, and by the way, the size of your building. But with those 3 things, you can develop what is the energy and emissions intensity from our buildings and make some plans for how to address those that major sector for Lexington. So again, on the reporting side of things, many of you probably realize this, but when you go in for your annual inspection of your motor vehicle, they know what your kind of car you have, and they know how many miles you've traveled since your last inspection. What that means is that the Registry of Motor Vehicles knows how much emissions every town is generating from the cars in their vicinity, in their location. And in 2012, we had an enterprising MIT senior who unpacked the RMV data for the entire state and was able to tell us how many vehicles we had registered in town, what the make and model of those vehicles were, how many miles they traveled, and hence we could figure out how much emissions we had. And what we found were some interesting things. Most people think that cars travel 12,000 miles a year, but in Lexington, they travel 9,400 miles a year. So anyway, one of the things we need at the state level is that this information be provided to municipalities so we can start to manage the number 2 priority in our town, which is transportation for reducing emissions. I mentioned before that one of the most important things we need to do is stop building fossil fuel buildings going forward. We need to be, for all new construction, starting to develop our buildings with heat pumps. And last year at town meeting, we passed 175-7 with 96% approval, a clean heat warrant article that calls for all new construction to be built with heat pumps and to do that in a healthy, comfortable, and affordable way. And what in Lexington, this is a big deal. A lot of people don't think it's a big deal, but we're building lots of new houses in Lexington every year. It's about 1 million square feet of construction every 2 years. This requires legislative approval to take effect, which has not yet occurred. One of the things we need is a net zero stretch energy code, so we don't have to wait for legislative approval. Another thing we did in town meeting recently is Article 17. We amended our zoning bylaw to require that the labs that are being built in town use as their primary source of energy, their primary source of heat, electric heat pumps. And let me give you a little bit of an idea that may not sound like such a big deal, but let me put this in some context. On the left side of this screen, what you're seeing is that we use about 900 million, we emit about 900 million pounds of CO2 a year in Lexington. And that first thing, the CM today is this is the commercial district today. You can see that the amount of emissions seems relatively low, but we're in a mode right now where all these new lab buildings are being built, and it looks like we're going to triple the amount of space that is being used in our commercial zones for labs. They're building massively new large labs. And because those labs are life science buildings, they're using significantly higher energy intensity than your traditional office buildings. What that means is that that commercial zone, if we didn't do anything at all, could grow 6x. And as you can see, the growth in emissions is more than all the emissions from every one of the houses in Lexington. It's more than all the emissions from every one of the cars in Lexington. And so if we do nothing, every effort we've made to reduce our emissions in our cars by switching to electric cars or by putting heat pumps in our homes is in vain. So what we required is said, we want every one of the labs that's building new labs to design with hybrid so that they're starting, their base load of the building is electric. And if those companies buy 100% renewable electricity, we can actually grow our lab size by 3x and reduce our emissions. I talked about fixing gas leaks. It's been a major effort of the Mothers Out Front group in Lexington, who identified this as a big problem for us back in 2014, 2015. In that time, we found that there was 89 leaks in Lexington, and that one of them was over 30 years old. So we started a campaign to find and fix the biggest leaks in Lexington in cooperation with National Grid. And we found new methods to fix leaks and do that in a way where we took the biggest ones were the highest priority. This is a big problem right now for our future. I can talk about this later in the questions. One of the things I want to sort of show here in this slide is that even if we reduce, in the middle picture, this natural gas picture, even if we reduce all of our gas leaks to zero over the next, say, 20 years or so, natural gas will continue to emit emissions. There's no way around that. But even with electric resistance heat or air source heat pumps or ground source heat pumps, as we green the grid and we get to 100% renewable electricity, we will have zero emissions from our buildings. And the interesting thing, this is Lexington right now, it says winter 2021. It's actually this winter. These are the numbers for right now. It costs about $2,000 more to heat your house with a propane furnace than with an air source heat pump. It costs about $1,700 more to heat with an oil furnace than an air source heat pump, and about $300 or $400 more to heat with a gas furnace than an air source heat pump. So we can do this economically today. Even 2 years ago, this was not the case, but natural gas prices have gone up so significantly that we are now in a situation where it pays to switch to air source heat pumps from any one of the fossil fuels. And this is a chart from Rocky Mountain Institute that shows that you can start with heat pumps at a lower cost than a natural gas furnace and an air conditioning system. And in a retrofit, the total life cycle cost is lower even in a retrofit situation. Now, I mentioned vulnerability. One of the things that we think about is what happens when you get one of these extreme storms. And we're all been sort of inconvenienced by losing the power for 6 hours, 8 hours, 10 hours. Some of us have lost power for 5 days at a time, and some of our neighbors have lost power for 3 or 4 weeks at a time. So when we started to think about what is necessary in order for the town to provide services in a extended outage, we started, our Senator Barrett, by the way, our Lexington Senator Barrett's climate bill enabled the utilities to build microgrids for municipalities. And what you're looking at here in this map is the Lexington Firehouse. And one of the things you want to do is during an extreme outage, you certainly want the fire folks to be able to go out and address any safety issues. But if you're out of power for 3 weeks, you need food, you need medicine, you need to get gasoline, you need banking, you need emergency medical care. And what you're looking at here, this is the center of Lexington near the fire station. All of those things are nearby. We have Walgreens, we have Stop and Shop, we've got banks, we've got gas stations, and 2 emergency medical facilities. And Eversource has proposed to the select board that they would put solar panels in the canopies backed up with energy storage systems and make this entire grid, this entire block microgrid that would be highly resilient and able to run on its own and provide all those essential services to Lexington residents during a 3-week outage. We've also taken a look at something called the Geoblock, this idea of a geothermal network that would go underneath our streets that would provide renewable energy for our buildings. National Grid has just gotten approval, again, enabled by this climate bill, to build geothermal networks in the street. And they have proposed doing this in Lexington on our Hartwell Avenue lab corridor, where we could have essentially the buildings on the street using ground source heat pumps that are amortized by, the cost is amortized by the utilities over 50 or 60 years. So that provides tremendous benefits in terms of transitioning. One of the things that has just been announced in the last week or two is that Mass Save has got their new 2022 to 2025 rebates out, and they are now switching from a focus of upgrading your light bulbs to upgrading your house. And they're now making $15,000 available for people who are switching from fossil fuel boilers to heat pumps, $15,000 for whole house electrification. The other thing that I would say is that how does this work in people's houses? People say, how do I put a heat pump in? Well, everybody raise your hand if you've got an air conditioner at your house, right? No one should ever buy another air conditioner. Let me say that again, no one should ever buy another air conditioner, because heat pumps only cost a few dollars more than an air conditioner, and they go both ways. They operate in reverse as well as forward. My friends from Australia. They call their heat pumps reverse cycle air conditioners. And my friend from Australia says to me, Mark, would you buy a car that could only go in reverse? And the answer is no, you wouldn't buy a car that could only go in one direction. You would want a car that goes in both directions. Would you buy a car that only operates in the summer? No, you wouldn't buy a car that only operates in the summer. Why would you do that for an air conditioner? So when it comes time to replace your air conditioner, replace it with a heat pump, and you're going to get heat for free. Heat pumps can do both. Accelerating solar. We've all been patting ourselves on the back for years, thinking that Massachusetts is one of the leaders in solar in the country, and that has been the case through 2017. Our Governor Deval Patrick put in place net metering and community choice programs that drove us forward to one of the best solar energy states in the country. But since that time, we've been falling off by half each year. We need to start figuring out how to align utility interests behind our goals of switching to 100% renewable electricity. And one of the things I'd like you to ask you to talk to your legislators about right now, the utilities have a limit of 10 kW that you can put on your own roof. It should be 25. 25 will get you enough to run your heat pumps and your electric cars and all the electricity you need. Right now, we have artificial limits that were set 15, 20 years ago, back when solar was much less efficient than it is today. We should be allowing people, uncapping the limits on solar for residential homes.
Hey, Mark,
Yes.
we've got a lot of good questions. So if you can wrap it up in 5 minutes, they'll have a chance to answer a few. Good luck.
Okay, I'll do that. So transportation, everybody knows that we need to be switching to electric vehicles, whether those are cars, buses. We just got a grant in Lexington to buy our first electric school bus. But here's the thing, you look in the bottom right-hand corner of this picture, if all we do is switch everybody from gas cars to electric cars, we're all going to be sitting in traffic in our electric cars. So the number one thing we need to be thinking about is how to reduce the vehicle miles traveled in our cars, and how do we make our town walkable, bikeable? How do we get more people riding their bikes on the Minuteman Bikeway, taking public transportation? And of course, we need to ensure that our public transportation is electric. I'll just move quite through a couple of these slides. Everything that I've talked about today has health benefits. Everything we've talked about eliminates particulate matter. That's from heating with oil, our diesel and gas vehicles, cooking with gas inside, whether it's our gas-powered lawn care equipment. All of these things have important health impacts and health benefits of switching. And I couldn't talk about any of this without talking about waste and recycling and composting. We talked about food, how important food is. 40% of our food is wasted. 30% of all of the trash that goes out is food waste. So we are working hard to get the town to adopt curbside composting pickup, and we've established producer plastic, single-use plastic bans in town. Finally, as I mentioned before, the solutions that we've talking about make everything else better. Our physical health, our mental health. We get to have clean water, clean air. It's justice and equity. I haven't talked enough about environmental justice today, but every one of the things we do here helps on environmental justice and biodiversity and livable planet. And one of the final things I'll just use to wrap up, the University of Colorado suggests that it is the social norms, the unwritten rules of our communities that matter way more than the rebates and the incentives and the legislation that's passed at our state level in terms of finding solutions to solve these difficult problems. And it's neighborliness and social cohesion and family relationships that are important to finding these solutions. So working together is the only answer. And the most important thing in a crisis is neighbors who know each other and care about each other. This is a quote from our superintendent of schools, Dr. Julie Hackett. And she says, in the happiness equation, the two things that matter are strong relationships and a sense of purpose. And that's what we need to solve the climate crisis. So choose health and well-being. Thank you.
Wow. Unbelievable. Thank you so much. We got a lot of good questions here. Let me start. Got to go into chat again. Okay, but they were right there a minute ago. Sorry, I just scooped them up. Somebody help me. I know, here we go. Well, one of the questions several people asked, Ingrid, one of the first, Ingrid Geis, I'd be interested to hear about how you got 10,000 folks in Lexington. Is that people or households to purchase 100% clean energy? How did you do it? What were the marketing tactics used?
The marketing tactics are we made it the default in the community choice program, and it's 10,000 households, 10,000 customers. So when we looked at, there's all these psychological studies out. If you go back to your companies, the 401k companies, what they found is that if the default was not to sign up for a 401k, even if the company was providing a match, very few people actually signed up. And if you made it the default that you got signed up and you could opt out later, almost everybody signed up for a 401k with a match. And so we said, we want to take that psychological learnings to heart in terms of our utility community choice program. And we made 100% renewable the default.
There's a question here from Mary Sadad asking, how is electricity generated and what's the impact on the environment? That's her question. I think it may mean how green is the green energy?
Well, it's an interesting question and it changes constantly, but overall we get our electricity from the ISO New England grid, which is all of the New England states. There's a bunch of generators and different generators provide power into the grid. So if you think about it like a bathtub, there's natural gas plants that are generating electricity, and that electricity goes into the bathtub. And there are hydropower from Canada that's coming in that goes into the bathtub. There's offshore wind, there's onshore wind, there's solar power, there's a little bit of oil and a little bit of coal still left, but that all goes into the tub. And one of the things that Massachusetts requires that the renewable, they have something called a renewable portfolio standard. They require that the power producers put more renewable energy into the grid every year. And right now that number is going up by 3% a year. So every year the grid gets greener and we sort of tap out of the drain at the bottom. So all those electrons go into the tub and we get a mix of that out the bottom. But when Lexington says we're going to buy 100% renewable electricity, our suppliers are required to put enough electricity to supply Lexington all 100% renewable into the grid.
There's a lot of interest in this question. And one of them has to do with from the Winchester folks who are saying that Lexington has a mix, a renewable electricity mix, which includes less desirable electricity from old and more distant sources, whereas the which means you're less pretty much you're less expensive than we are in Winchester that require it to be kind of new local.
They're so right. So the answer is that when we started our program in 2017, the constraints we had from our town meeting were, give me as much renewable electricity as you can while still being less than Eversource. So what we did was we said, we're going to buy as much local class 1 Massachusetts RECs as possible, and then top off with national wind RECs. And since that point in time, we've raised that amount of local renewable energy in our We're now up to between the state mandate and the Lexington mandate, 40% class 1 local renewable electricity in our supply as default. And of course, we have 100% local as an opt-up in our community choice program.
The next question is, do you have a drink of water there? You're really going nonstop. The question is, what was the spark that first ignited your passion for climate action?
Katrina.
Oh,
Katrina. I woke up and said, this has got to stop. And I was actually at a company where our entire business was aviation. And so we were helping rich people put lots of emissions into the grid, and I quit and started a solar company. So that was that. And I said, there's nothing a dad won't do for his kids.
wow.
That's that.
Well, Katrina was the example for me and a lot of the people in our church who went down there several times afterwards to realize, understand environmental justice, the idea that the worst impacts were in the minority neighborhoods.
And still.
Knowing that even a committed individual has limited capacity to devote to climate action, what advice can you give on how to decide what one should undertake that would be the most effective and useful?
Work with other folks. There is nothing better than working with other committed individuals towards your goal. Let me tell you, if you try to do it alone, you're going to burn out in about a week. If you do it with other people, you will be continually reinforced. And you can achieve a lot more with other people's help. All of these things that I've talked about, every one of them has been with a large group of other committed citizens in Lexington have made it possible. Every one of them, a large number of committed group of people.
John asks, you've got a climate organizations in Lexington have devoted much of their energies to lobbying state legislation for passage of laws. Is that an idea that would that help municipal governments execute aggressive climate policies, or isn't there that much relationship?
Well, that's a really good question. So for me, you asked what my motivation was, sort of back to Katrina, and you may remember that back in that time there was Copenhagen and there was Markey Waxman, and those things didn't pan out. And so I said to myself, the only thing that's going to pan out that I have any control over is local action. And so what can I do as a group of my own friends? And we started out just doing our own houses, right? So we got our own houses upgraded, and then that was 6 months, and we're like, okay, now what do we do? Because that's not going to change the world. So here's a really fun story. One of the guys in my church said, Mark, you got to change the building code. And so we went and we put together a group of people and said, our job is to get Lexington to change the building code, the stretch energy code. We adopted the stretch energy code. And a friend of mine at the time said to me, Mark, why are you spending your time on this? Why? Even if you get Lexington to adopt this stretch energy code and all the new buildings are 20% better, what difference is it going to make in the overall scheme of things? Who cares? And I said, well, other than it being the right thing to do, let's start with it's the right thing to do. But here's the interesting thing that happened. Because Lexington was all in and got behind this, we executed against this tremendously. It was a success story in Lexington. The Massachusetts DOER took the success that had occurred in Lexington statewide, and then they took it to the International energy conference. And 2 years later, 47 states had adopted the stretch energy code. 2 years later, started with, Lexington wasn't the only town that did this. So we were the number 5 town to adopt the stretch energy code. But, towns like your town can make a big difference by executing these things and making these pilot programs work well. And then other people are willing to follow.
Wow. Well, thanks a lot. We've kind of running out of time. You have been, your presentation was great. Your answers are great. And you not only give a lot of information, but you do it in a really engaging manner. And thank you so much. We are looking forward to seeing all of you next Sunday when our drawdown video will be Stopping Climate Change. The video explores the sources and impacts of greenhouse gases and focuses on 3 critical paths to reversing the buildup of these gases in Earth's atmosphere. And one you've heard a lot about today from Mark. 1 is reducing sources. 2 is supporting nature's sinks for storing carbon. And 3 is centering equality in global action. Next week, our guest speaker will be Ken Pruitt, who with 25 years in climate action experience has recently become the first sustainability director of Winchester, Massachusetts. Ken will describe the 3 strategies Winchester is following to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and how individuals can follow the same strategies to decarbonize their homes and vehicles. And you've heard about some of them today from Mark. Since you registered for this event, you've already registered for any of the next 5 units you wish to attend and via the same Zoom link. I hope you'll be here and bring a friend, colleague, or member of your family. Encourage them to watch the video before they come. In other words, if they skip this week, have them watch the video you saw today. We're going to close now, but we're going to leave you with a music video you're going to really enjoy, and leave the chat open so you can give us some tips on how to do a better job for you next week. And thank you again for coming. And here's the music video.
This is an open letter from you and me together. Tomorrow's in our hands now.
Find the words that matter, say them out loud, and make it better somehow.
Looking down from up on the moon is a tiny blue marble. Who'd have thought the ground we stand on
Could be so fragile.
This is a love song to the earth. You're no ordinary world, a diamond in the universe. Heaven's poetry to us. Keep it science. Keep it science. Keep it
It's our world.
'Cause it's our world.
Please keep it safe.
It's our world.
It's our world.
It's our world.
'Cause it's our world.